The history of agricultural machinery is filled with innovation, trial, error, and occasionally disaster. While tractors have been essential in revolutionizing modern farming, the drive to build bigger and more powerful machines hasn't always led to success. Some of the largest tractors ever created were plagued with mechanical issues, design flaws, impracticality, or poor timing in the marketplace. Instead of becoming icons of progress, they became cautionary tales of what happens when engineering ambition overshoots reality. This article explores 10 of the worst large tractors ever built, not because size in itself is a problem, but because these machines demonstrated that raw scale without balance, reliability, or usability can be a recipe for failure. The concept of massive tractors was born out of necessity. As farms grew larger in North America, Australia, and parts of Eastern Europe, farmers sought machines capable of pulling bigger implements over vast stretches of land. Tractor manufacturers responded by designing units with enormous horsepower ratings, often dwarfing the conventional models of their time. However, in trying to solve the problem of efficiency, these machines often created more challenges than they addressed. They were expensive, difficult to maintain, poorly adapted to changing agricultural practices, or simply overbuilt for the demands of real-world farming. One of the most infamous examples of oversized ambition gone wrong was the Big Bud 747. Built in Montana during the 1970s, it still holds the record as the largest farm tractor ever manufactured, boasting a staggering 1,100 horsepower. On paper, it was a marvel, capable of pulling enormous cultivators across thousands of acres. In reality, it was completely impractical for most farmers. Its sheer size limited its maneuverability, transportation was a logistical nightmare, and its fuel consumption was astronomical. While it has achieved legendary status as a spectacle, it never represented a realistic tool for everyday agriculture. The Big Bud demonstrated that being the biggest doesn't mean being the best. It was more museum piece than practical workhorse. Another contender for worst large tractor status was the Steiger Panther KP525, produced during the 1980s. Steiger was known for building powerful four-wheel drive tractors, but the Panther KP525 pushed the boundaries in a way that backfired. With more than 500 horsepower, it was a giant among its peers. Unfortunately, it suffered from serious transmission and reliability problems that left many owners frustrated. Parts were costly, and downtime during peak farming seasons could be devastating. The tractor also landed on the market just as the 1980s farm crisis was squeezing farmers financially. Few operations could justify the cost of such a machine, and those who did often regretted the investment. In the same era, International Harvester made its own misstep with the International 4786, another four-wheel drive giant that turned out to be more liability than asset. It was underpowered compared to its weight, meaning it guzzled fuel without delivering proportional efficiency. Farmers complained about constant overheating problems, electrical issues, and a cab that was uncomfortable for long workdays. Worse, its resale value plummeted quickly, leaving many owners stuck with machines that were neither reliable nor profitable. If the 1980s were littered with oversized disappointments, the early attempts at supersized tractors in the 1960s also left behind some notorious flops. The versatile 145, one of the early Canadian-made four-wheel drive machines, had noble intentions but became infamous for its fragile drivetrain. Farmers who expected durability found themselves saddled with costly repairs and a tractor that couldn't handle the very heavy work it was marketed for. It was an example of how the leap from standard to supersized machines required engineering refinements that hadn't yet been mastered. Eastern Europe also has its share of questionable large tractors. The Kirovet's K700A, produced in the Soviet Union, was massive and visually imposing, but suffered from a reputation for crude construction and unreliable engines. Farmers frequently complained of poor ergonomics, clunky controls, and the machine's tendency to break down under pressure. In theory, it was built for the immense fields of collective farms, but its lack of finesse and reliability made it a nightmare to operate. While it became widespread due to government distribution, rather than farmer choice, its reputation as one of the worst big tractors lingers in agricultural history. Moving forward in time, the John Deere 8020 of the early 1960s deserves mention. It was Deere's first attempt at a four-wheel drive tractor, rated at around 215 horsepower, which at the time seemed extraordinary. Unfortunately, the tractor was a mechanical letdown. Its power shift transmission proved unreliable, and Deere ended up producing only 100 units before discontinuing it. While it paved the way for future large Deere tractors, the 8020 itself was such a headache that it stands as one of the company's worst missteps in the large tractor category. A similar story surrounds the Alice Chalmers HD41, which remains one of the most powerful tractors ever built by the company. Designed as a massive crawler tractor rather than a wheeled unit, it was promoted as a machine that could transform large-scale farming and construction projects. In practice, it was notoriously expensive to maintain, suffered from underwhelming hydraulics, and was far too large for the majority of farming operations. It was less of a farm tractor and more of a showpiece for the idea of size. Few were sold, and most ended up being used in industrial applications rather than agriculture, highlighting how misaligned the design was with the real needs of farmers. Then there was the Case IH Steiger Quadtrac 9380, introduced in the 1990s. On the surface, it seemed like a dream: high horsepower, 4 independent tracks for improved traction, and advanced technology. Unfortunately, the early models were plagued with track reliability issues. Constant breakdowns, high maintenance costs, and difficulty sourcing parts frustrated owners. While later Quadtrac models would become highly respected, the 9380 remains a reminder of how early overambition can create reputational scars. The Chamberlain 90 series, produced in Australia, also makes the list. Designed to serve the vast expanses of Australian wheat farms, these tractors were undeniably powerful. Yet their engineering failed to meet the demands of harsh Australian conditions. Cooling systems were inadequate for long days in extreme heat, components wore out quickly, and farmers frequently found themselves stranded far from service centers with an immovable hulk of machinery. The tractors were soon regarded as impractical despite their size and promise. Finally, the ACCO Super Bulldozer tractor, built in Italy in the 1980s, deserves mention as one of the strangest and least practical giants. Constructed by the Italian company ACCO, it was an attempt to build the largest crawler tractor in the world, with an engine output rivaling locomotives. However, it was so enormous that it had no practical application in agriculture. Transporting it was impossible without disassembly, and no farmer could conceivably justify its use. The tractor essentially became a monument to excess rather than a functional piece of equipment. Across these 10 machines, the recurring theme is not that size itself is inherently bad. Large tractors have their place, especially on massive farms where efficiency depends on covering thousands of acres quickly. But when engineering fails to match size with durability, or when manufacturers ignore the economic realities of their customers, the result is failure. Farmers need tractors that balance power with reliability, cost with efficiency, and innovation with practicality. These worst examples show what happens when manufacturers forget that balance. Looking back, many of these tractors are now celebrated curiosities, photographed at shows or preserved in museums. The Big Bud 747, for instance, attracts visitors simply because of its legendary bulk, while models like the John Deere 8020 are collector's items despite their failings. In their failure, they serve a purpose. They remind us that progress in agricultural machinery is not a straight line, but a process of experimentation, learning, and sometimes spectacular mistakes. The legacy of these oversized disappointments is ultimately educational. They prove that farmers are not impressed by size alone. What matters most is usability, reliability, and return on investment. In the end, the 10 worst large tractors ever built earned their place in history, not for what they accomplished, but for the lessons they taught about the limits of ambition and the importance of practicality in farming.